2022 has definitely been a year for body horror movies. Hey guys, welcome back to the video. This video is my spoiler-free review of Crimes of the Future. As the human species adapts to synthetic environment, the body undergoes new transformations and mutations. Accompanied by his partner, celebrity performance artist Saul Tenser showcases the metamorphosis of his organs. Meanwhile, a mysterious group tries to use Saul's notoriety to shed light on the next phase of human evolution. Now, before we get into my spoiler-free thoughts, if you guys are new to me, make sure that subscribe button and notifications on so you don't miss any time I upload a video or I go live. Both wasting more time. Let's get right into it. So starting it off with the good, I actually think the score of this movie is really good. I think like from the first second to the final second, this movie had me encapsulated. Honestly, more than the visuals, the score. It was always going, and it was like this sci-fi but also mystical and mysterious and thrilling but dark and gritty score. I made a short film a few months ago and I composed like 99% of that score by myself, and it was very difficult. And I looked at movies like Good Time to kind of get inspiration, and this movie reminds me of a lot like the mix of techno, but also this one kind of dives into a little bit more medieval type of scores, and it mixes techno and medieval, which is something I would never expect from a movie, but I really like how it turned out. And it really signified this evolutionized world and how this world is completely different from ours, and you can literally tell that from the first second, just right when the score starts to play. Also, the cinematography in this movie is really good. I have some flaws with the visuals in terms of how it does affect the story sometimes, which I'll talk about later in this video, but as a whole, I think the cinematography is great. I think the cinematography is one of the highest points of this movie, but at times it does feel like it is style over substance, but not as much as movies, for example, like Men, which also released earlier this year. I thought that movie was visually stunning, but a lot of times it just felt like there wasn't any substance under there. In this movie, it does feel like most of the time all the shots are there for a reason. It doesn't feel like they force anything in there just to make it look cool. I will say there were a few CG shots that were iffy, but it's nothing to detract from the movie, because as a whole, I really liked how they implemented the dystopian technology and how they don't overuse it. I mean, they use it a lot. Obviously, we're in this dystopian world, but there's also a side, kind of like the street level side of this world, and I like how they merge and mix both sides, because as I said in the synopsis, there's the regular story and then there's like a mysterious group story, and I'll get into talking about that later in this video because I wasn't the biggest fan of like the pacing of the movie overall. But the original story is another good thing I actually like. I mean, I'm all for original stories. 2022 has been a phenomenal year for original movies. Everything Everywhere All at Once, The Northman, Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. There's so many great original movies out this year, but this story, though it does have a great original idea, I don't think they executed on it too well. And that's where we get into the bad of this movie. So I have to say the story isn't the best in this film. First of all, I do want to dive into the pacing before I get into too many story details. This movie started too late into its runtime, or at least it got intriguing too late into its runtime, and then it ended way too quickly. It feels like there's literally the resolution and then the movie is over, slash like a revelation, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to give away too much about the plot because I went into this movie not knowing much, and I still enjoyed the story as a whole, like the idea of this dystopian world. Again, that's all great, but it's sometimes it is just a snooze fest. It is such a different world that in order to move along the story, it's just a bunch of dumps of exposition. There's like this one setting and they always go there to do some exposition dump, and it's very annoying. It's very just it's a snooze fest at times. But back to the story, there's like a main part of this story where it kind of revolves around intimacy through surgery. So it's basically like instead of sex in this dystopian world, it's actually surgery. That's that intimate act, and that's a cool thing. Like that's an original idea that I've never seen before, and it's really weird, really crazy. It allows for some crazy gory shots, but they never really push that far enough in my opinion. You know, there's that mysterious group, and that kind of comes into play in like the last act of this movie, and it feels like everything is just rushed. It doesn't feel like anything has taken its time, even though this was a 2-hour movie that felt like it was 2.5 to 3 hours long just because of how poor the pacing was. It didn't feel like they utilized their time properly, and it felt like they were trying to do too much with telling these two different stories and trying to merge them together, and they were telling them simultaneously while characters from both stories were interacting. So it's not like it was a completely different story that came out of nowhere. They were building it from literally the first frame of this film. But another big problem with the story is how repetitive it got. At a certain point, it just felt like they were giving us a bunch of exposition dumps over and over, and when they did that, they didn't really realize that, okay, we already know this. Like, I know you're telling another character, but as the audience, we already know this. I don't want to hear it again. But that's all I really have to say about the story. I just have a lot of core issues with it, but I do want to move on and talk about the bad acting in this movie. So this movie does star Kristen Stewart, Leah Sadox, Viggo Mortensen, and Scott Speedman. And I'm going to be honest, no acting in this movie is good. I think that the main character played by Viggo Mortensen, he's a good character. Like, the character is so unique that I expected way more from the acting side of things. And it was cool acting, you know, it's just there. It's very average. Like, no performance in this movie really blew me away. Kristen Stewart is the one that I could say is closest to being a good performance, but everything just felt so bland and so boring to me in this movie in terms of acting. And with how unique this concept is, I expected way more from these super unique characters. I expected these actors and actresses to put more of a twist on their characters, and that just really didn't happen throughout any of the runtime. And then finally, the gore in this movie, it's actually good. I will say, like, it's utilized well, but sometimes they overutilize it in one spot and then they don't use it enough in another spot. So the part where they didn't use it enough, there's not as much impact, if that makes sense. Like, when you blow someone's brains out and then you just like head, like it's kind of like there's not a comparison. Just the level of impact for the gore was kind of messed up throughout the entirety of this movie, and I didn't really feel like it had that big of an impact or as big as it should have. But overall, I don't think I can recommend Crimes of the Future to everyone. If you're a fan of body horror, you might actually enjoy this one, but it does have a fairly repetitive and boring story, a lot of pacing issues, and the acting really just doesn't do anything for this film. Overall, I'm gonna give Crimes of the Future a 6 out of 10. But guys, that's it for this video. If you've already seen or you want to check out Crimes of the Future, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.